Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Once again, we're remote, dealing with issues that affect boards and companies in the COVID-19 crisis. So today is part 2 of a session that we're doing about compensation committees. And today we're going to be talking about key considerations when analyzing director compensation during the COVID-19 crisis. And joining me again for part 2 is Bob Romanchek, who's a partner and senior consultant with Meridian Compensation Partners. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you, TK.
Okay, so last week we talked about executive compensation, and particularly the fact that it probably was put into place in February. All hell breaks loose in March. Now we've got a very unstable future, not knowing exactly what's going to happen and when everything will be back. And we related that to executive compensation. Well, today we want to talk about director compensation. So with that, all that stability in mind, talk a little bit about the discussions that are going on in compensation committees today relative to director compensation.
Right. So this is an ancillary conversation. So of course, the board is very well focused on financial performance, shareholder return, a host of issues that are broader company-wide. They get to the point then of realizing in certain industries, those that are really impacted by the COVID-19 virus, where that could be the point where there's no revenues coming in, and they have made employee furloughs and cutbacks and permanent terminations, froze pay, froze merit increases. And then to the executives, there's a good chance that CEOs got a 50% base pay decrease, other executives 20-25%. And the obvious next question then is, what happens to outside director compensation? Big difference here. Outside directors are not employees. And because of that, they don't have performance-based compensation. They have a fiduciary duty to shareholders, and if they had performance-based pay, they could change stock or hit a goal pretty easily with an announcement. So because of that, it is not common and typical at all if they have performance-based pay. So the pay questions for outside directors are entirely different than they would be for the executive or even the broad-based employee.
So, there certainly was pressure on the senior executives to take pay cuts with all that's going on. It looks good visually and whatever. I would expect that there's the same challenge with directors as well. And what do you see in directors taking pay cuts so far from the meetings that you've had?
Yeah. So just prevalence first. We were approaching about 500 public companies that have taken pay cuts, decreases, deferrals for the executive population. For outside directors, prevalence is about half, which is interesting statistic. You would think they would match similar industries, of course. So if you're taking pay cuts for executives, the board typically would consider that. I believe the lag in prevalence very simply is we haven't hit the annual meetings for many boards. As soon as we hit that, I think the numbers for outside director pay cuts will increase and mimic that for executives. But outside directors, the great preponderance of those are now elected every year, the entire board, and their compensation is set on an annual basis during their term. So as we get to mid-May or so, when most annual meetings are happening, and the new director slate is put in place and elected, and their new compensation goes into process, I think you're going to have more public disclosure there of some cutbacks. And in their case, as I mentioned, no performance-based pay. You really have two major pay components. It's the cash retainer and meeting fees, but cash and equity. And on the cash side, if you've your annual retainer, that is what's being impacted. So for those organizations who had made cutbacks, the most common by far approach would be cut the cash retainer back by 50%. Some organizations are deferring it, but most the strong majority practice is literally to cut outside director cash retainer for either the rest of the year or for a specified period of time to be renewed, like 3 months. If you look at the stock retainer, that's not being cut back. But again, that usually happens in a one-time grant at the annual meeting. So we're approaching that date. We'll see what happens. But there are some pretty significant discussions that we had there, mainly the stock price when you made your grants to executives back in February was twice what it is going to be in May, potentially. So does that mean outside directors actually get twice as many shares for the same value, since most organizations are granting a value? And that's, I think, one of the most material issues outside directors and the comp committee is going to have to face. Do we use the same higher stock price for executives? Do we cut back on the long-term grant? And knowing the most common approach is plain stock, restricted stock or units, full value shares with a 1-year vest. So there's not a lot of decision going forward as far as long-term performance and goals set up. It's simply a time-based vesting. So the value is the big question. What happens with the equity grant at the annual meeting?
Yeah, that could be something that gets a lot of attention. And you can imagine if they did that at the executive level and at the director level, the potential is to put some pressure on the shares that you have in plan reserve, okay? Because you may have to go to your annual meeting and increase your reserve if you do that. But I think the bigger issue is what you've said. That's going to draw a lot of attention. If you start issuing shares significantly and at this lower end price, I think you're going to certainly draw attention from proxy advisors and certain institutional investors. So, Bob, another question for you, though. I've heard a lot of boards are meeting actually on a weekly basis. It may just be for an hour to get updated, on what's going on, which is a good practice. Communication is the most important part of this COVID-19 crisis. But that sort of raises the question, if there's still companies on meeting fees, and I know that companies have moved, a portion of companies have moved away from meeting fees, but there's still a fair portion that offer that. Does that mean that director pay is running up because you get a meeting fee for each of these calls, or how does that work?
Right. In most cases, that does qualify. A phone conversation with two more outside directors talking about company business does qualify as a meeting. And in most cases, that's a $1,500 fee that they will earn for that. And you're right. A majority of companies have done away with meeting fees. They've increased the cash and stock retainer to estimate what a typical year would be like. Yet many organizations have a release valve where if you have more than a common number of meetings, the meeting fee might kick back in again. And consider those that are in highly regulated industries, those where M&A is very frequent, or they have other issues happening, may be accustomed to having a lot of meetings. But you're right, everybody is meeting very frequently right now, and those are extra fees. In my opinion, if you add all that up, it's still not necessarily so material. It's obviously not going to hurt earnings. It's kind of a rounding error, but it's the perception. And so that may get part of the process and policy of waiving some compensation for outside directors when we get to the annual meeting and beyond. Yet, they're not paying airfare and hotel and meals by meeting by phone. So there is a little bit of an offset. But TK, you're exactly right. That does qualify, and extra fees should and would lie in that case.
Well, we're running out of time. I just want to pass along some other guidance or consideration here. First is the importance of documenting any meetings around compensation or director's compensation. If lawsuits follow, you want to make sure that you have a good explanation that would sort of kick in the business judgment rule. It's okay for boards to make bad decisions. It's not okay if they haven't thought through and done research prior to making those decisions. So I think that's important. I think it's important to think through the story that you're going to be telling in next year's proxy about what you've done this year. That's a very relevant issue. And the last piece which is sensitive to the executives, but to directors as well, and that's insider trading. With all the communication that's going on, there's absolutely no question that directors have insider information every week that's not public. So they should be very, very careful relative to when they buy and sell their company stock. And hopefully general counsels in those companies have put on some major restrictions just to play safe, because the window is a very narrow window now for anybody to do that. So, Bob, I appreciate both the executive comp and the director guidance that you've offered. Thanks for taking the time to join us on the comp committee issues.
You're welcome.
And that concludes this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week to take another look at critical topics that'll help you be a better board member or committee member in the COVID-19 crisis. And we'll see you then. Thank you.